From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, speaking to you from Los Angeles. As always, my co-host David Feldman in New York City. And in studio with Ralph, the man of the hour, is our guest, a longtime friend of Ralph's, Victor Schwartz. David, tell our listeners about Victor Schwartz.
Victor Schwartz is a partner in the law firm of Shook, Hardy & Bacon and chairs its public policy group. The public policy group seeks to be in the vanguard of developing public policy issues that will improve our civil justice system. In March 2013, the National Law Journal named Mr. Schwartz one of the 100 most influential lawyers in the United States. He was also named a super lawyer by Washington, D.C. super lawyers in 2013 and 2014, and received the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Institute for Legal Reform's 2013 Individual Achievement Award for his contributions to reforming America's civil justice system.
Welcome, Mr. Schwartz.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Now, Ralph, you and Victor go back a long way.
Yes, we're adversaries on a number of issues involving the right to wrongfully injured people to have their full day in court. He has represented corporate clients effectively. Despite his first name, he has experienced a number of defeats at the state and federal level, but he's also experienced a number of victories. I don't like some of the proposals he's made, and that's what we're going to discuss today in a good sequential way so that the public can understand what this battle called tort reform, or what I call tort deform, is all about. It involves millions of dollars, bills in state legislatures, lobbies, pressure on Congress, editorials in the Wall Street Journal. So welcome, Victor. Let's just set the stage. You were formerly a law professor, and you authored a popular casebook on tort law for law students. Let's just set the stage. Tell the audience what torts are, what tort law has accomplished, and how ordinary people who are wrongfully injured can go about finding a lawyer to use it.
Tort law is the part of law that tells you when you have a right to sue somebody, and it also defines people's obligations to make safe products, to tell the truth. Persons can access tort law because we have a system of contingency fees. A poor person as well as a rich person can get a lawyer because the fee will come out of the award, and the lawyer takes the risk of loss. If the case is lost, the client doesn't have to pay any legal expense, and it gives people access to justice. Tort law can help improve society, and at times it does, but it also can overreach. It's a little like those machines in the airport. That's how I see tort law. If they're too cold, somebody who's a terrorist can get through. If they're too hot, it goes off if somebody has a filling. So I kind of try to move it toward the middle. Ralph may see it differently, but that's how I see America's tort law. And it's made by the states generally. It's state law generally.
Well, tort law has been viewed as having three purposes. One, compensate. People are injured by negligent doctors, defective cars, unsafe pharmaceuticals. The second is that it discloses, sometimes for the first time, evidence of design defects, construction defects in public. And the third, it's supposed to produce some deterrence. That is, it hits a corporation in the pocketbook, and that corporation, other corporations say, we better be more careful. Do you have any comments on any one of those three functions?
Well, I would say with deterrence, it has to be hot enough to deter wrongful conduct. If it's too high, then somebody may not put a product on the market that's a good product, or they may not engage in a medical practice because they have fear of lawsuits. And finding the line where tort law is adequate in its deterrence, but is not overheated, is not easy, Ralph. It's just not. But I don't disagree with the purposes. I think the government is the best investigator, and sometimes people feel tort law is the only vehicle. I don't think so. I think if the government is on its toes, it can investigate, it can subpoena people.
Now, in recent months, there have been a lot of news articles on defective automobiles, Toyota, General Motors, faulty ignition switch, Honda, airbag problems, and less noticed are a lot of examples of defective products. A lawyer in Texas, very successful one, told me the other day that he settled a case with a defective bike for his paraplegic client. There are all kinds of examples where companies do not have proper quality control. The products reach you, the consumer, people get hurt, injured, killed. And here's what I want to ask you, because you're a legal scholar too, Victor. Lawyers who are licensed are officers of the court. So they are quasi-official people. They're not like anyone else. They have certain responsibilities. And when a defense lawyer, say for General Motors or Honda or Toyota or Merck or Pfizer, enters into negotiating to settle a case with a plaintiff's lawyer, very often, especially if it's one of the first cases and nobody knows about the defect, very often the defense lawyer will say, my client will give your client so much money for their injuries, but everything has to be secret. You have to sign a confidentiality agreement. Now, I hear from plaintiff lawyers around the country who say, our first duty is to our client, but we don't like the idea that we cannot inform the public about these defects. And the result is that years go by and people get killed and nobody knows about these defects. That's happened actually in the auto industry. I've always supported that the canons of ethics should be changed to make it an unprofessional condition by defense counsel, a violation of the canons suitably amended. If that doesn't happen, I'd like to see regulation basically saying it's against public policy for defense lawyers to require plaintiff lawyers to shut up about the defect, turn their discovered materials often over to the defense lawyer in return for getting money for their client. Now, what do you think about that? Do you think that places the plaintiff lawyer in an unfair conflict between his duty to client and his duty to the general public?
Well, one reason I'm here is that you and I have had different experiences, and I cannot deny your experience. You have more than I have. But in my experience with these situations, it's just my experience. The plaintiffs wants the thing sealed too. There are in discovery things are learned about their client that are private. They don't want those things disclosed. They don't want their brothers or sisters to know the amount of the settlement. So I've seen much more consensus, not plaintiff lawyers being dragged unwillingly into a confidential settlement. I don't deny your experience. That's the experience you've had. I wouldn't change the current system because it's needed to produce settlements. The government, if it can find out, and you can, about claims filed, they can find claims filed. And if a number of claims are filed against automobile company X, the government should be on its toes, and it can ask questions that may be in a sealed settlement. That sealed settlement just shuts up the plaintiff's lawyer and the defense lawyer, not the government. And sometimes these problems have arisen because the government has not been on its toes. They haven't watched the court dockets. So that's just my experience, which may be different than your own.
That's an interesting point. You're saying the Food and Drug Administration or the Auto Safety Agency, the Federal Aviation Administration, can penetrate those settlements once they hear about a case being filed.
Yes, they can ask the companies whatever they want. That only silences, and I've been part of these, the plaintiff's lawyer from speaking and the defense lawyer from speaking, but not the company. And they can go and ask the company a whole bunch of things. And I believe, and I've watched on TV the same things that you may have seen more personally. And I'm thinking, how did this happen for so many years? Why didn't the government get on its toes? They saw these suits being filed. And if I were a government official and I saw 10 cases filed against motor company X and it's mentioning defective brakes or something like that, I'd go and try to find out. I have subpoena power. The plaintiff's lawyers don't have that. But again, I don't deny your experience. Yeah. We all have our own experiences.
Just one quick question on this point. Let's say a lawyer represents a client on a deadly drug. Let's say it's a contaminated drug used as a blood thinner imported from China. This is an actual case, and over 100 people died. Let's say the defense counsel for the drug company says to the plaintiff's lawyer, I'll give your client $2 million. I want everything confidential, and I want you to agree that you will not inform the Food and Drug Administration about this. And the plaintiff lawyer says, you know, my first obligation is to my client, as well as to the contingent fee. And the plaintiff lawyer says to the defense lawyer, but you know, I'm also an officer of the court, And if I don't tell the Food and Drug Administration about this, other people are going to die. So why don't you give me an out just on that score so I can report to the public safety authorities what you and I both know in the interest of saving human life? What's your view?
Well, the defense lawyer is put in a very difficult position. He can talk to his client, and there are times, at least in my career, where I feel something is inappropriate, and I talk to my client about it, and sometimes they change their minds. A lawyer from a very big company said to me, "Your counsel, not an echo." Well, I don't know if that's true or not. I like to think it is. So in such a situation, the defense lawyer, at the very least, ought to speak to his client about it and involve the FDA and see if we can stop this. There are points where it is very challenging to be either a plaintiff's lawyer or a defense lawyer, where human life may be at risk. They can be challenging circumstances. Again, if claims were filed, not where there's a letter, but an actual court claim, the FDA has more power and enough people to keep track of that. And if we need better tracking systems, I'm for that. And then they can go and ask the company about the situation.
Let's move on to medical malpractice. Years ago, the Harvard School of Public Health, which you know, put out a report. This is a report by physicians saying that there were over 80,000 deaths from medical malpractice just in hospitals alone, that is, rural, suburban, and city hospitals. And it was considered the definitive study on this epidemic of preventable violence. Now, you know that the doctors' lobby, as well as the insurance lobby, have been very active trying to restrict the rights of victims of medical malpractice and getting their full day in court. One way they do it is by getting the legislatures in half the states, including Texas and California, to put a cap on a lifetime award for pain and suffering. Now, you're known, Victor, as not being a hardliner on tort reform, as you call it, that there are some things you think should be done and some things shouldn't be done, to be fair to the system. So I was intrigued the other day, you mentioned that you debunked the concept that there are frivolous lawsuits in medical malpractice. Could you explain that?
Well, it costs a lot of money to bring a medical malpractice claim. And at least in medical mal, with most lawyers, they look carefully before they decide whether to bring a claim. And if they feel they can't prove it because of the expense involved, they don't. There is a small part of the bar, and it is infinitesimal, but it's there, that sometimes believes that they can file a claim and get a settlement at nuisance value. That's not a lot of money, but that part of the bar does exist. It's the fraction of the time where the contingency fee system doesn't work. With respect to limits on damages, people debate that. The AMA says that reduces the cost of insurance. They believe that, and they'll point to California where the insurance has been more stable. The people on the other side say, well, if there's a cap on pain and suffering, and let's be clear, we're not talking about the actual damages somebody has received, that might make a plaintiff's lawyer less willing to bring a case because she thinks she's not going to get enough money. The debate about caps, it's back and forth. Most states have enacted them. The voters of California, who was subject to millions of dollars of ads, millions, last fall, voted 2-1 to keep their cap, which is $250,000. That's not huge for pain and suffering. So when it was exposed to the voters, that's what the voters decided.
Well, the initiative in California, the money that was spent by the insurance companies and the doctors was about 50 to 60 million, and the other side spent 7 million. But as you know, what made that a complicated verdict by the voters was there was a provision that required doctors to take drug tests. And so the doctors went crazy on that. I thought if it was just a standalone, because it goes back to Jerry Brown when he was governor the first time. In 1975, he signed the bill saying that no matter how serious the injury, paraplegia, quadriplegia, from negligent doctor or hospital, they couldn't get more than $250,000 for pain and suffering lifetime. Since then, inflation has eroded it, So it's down to effectively $70,000 in purchasing power. At what point, and you know some of these are horrible injuries. First of all, everyone in medicine can make a mistake. And second, 5 to 10% of the doctors shouldn't even be practicing. I mean, they're not competent to be practicing, or they're addicted, or for other reasons. So you're talking almost 2,000 deaths a week in the United States. More people die in California from medical malpractice by far than are killed in traffic accidents. Here's what I want to ask you as a scholar. At what point do the damages be restricted to such a low level that it, in effect, takes away your right of trial by jury under the Seventh Amendment?
I think any limit on, there's a challenge to any limit on your actual damages. And actual damages are not, for people who are listening, are not pain and suffering. Actual damages of what you've lost. And in my lifetime, I've seen and agree with plaintiffs' lawyers who have been able to expand what is called an actual or economic loss. Any nursing care, anything that conceivably in any way has a monetary value. We really have to be careful about limiting that. Pain and suffering, and there are studies on this, is one of the few damage elements that doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't make people feel any better. If they're a paraplegic, they don't feel better because they get a lot of money. It's not functional. And what I've thought is, it's just an idea, that pain and suffering might be limited to a third of the award. Where does that come from? It means the person can pay their legal fees. And if you go way back to 1915, long time ago, before Ralph was born, by the way, there was a person named Terry on negligence who said that would be the limit. And there's some basis for that. So that beyond that, I really can't go. I think that the medical profession needs to do as good a job as it can in policing itself. They are doing a much better job than they did even 10 years ago at trying to assure that those who are insured don't commit medical malpractice. One good trend is that some of the insurers are much more active in seeing that doctors take continuing courses, are trained, and are doing a better job with their patients.
Well, you know, the caps have reduced the number of cases that legitimately could have been filed. Because, as you say, it's not worth the expense if they have a draconian cap as they have in Virginia or California. But here's the question I want to ask you. The Centers for Disease Control says that about 200 to 250 people a day die in hospitals due to hospital-induced infections. And hospitals are beginning to wake up on this. They're requiring doctors, nurses to wash their hands and so forth. And by the way, the insurance companies who cover medical malpractice have consistently made a lot of money. Why don't the insurance companies become more interested earlier in loss prevention? They could have gone to these hospitals, just like the Hartford Boiler Insurance Company in the 19th century went to the factory and said, we're not going to insure you unless your boilers meet certain standards and don't blow up the factory. Why haven't these insurance companies, long time ago, because hospital-induced infections have been around for a long time, 250 a day, that's, close to 75,000 lives a year.
Well, my experience is, and I work with some of the hospitals, that they are doing a better job.
Recently.
Particularly the mutuals, which are owned by the doctors themselves. If their costs are going up, it's because of their own conduct. They own the insurance company. So it's in their self-interest to act and be more active in prevention. I've had chances to talk to hospitals about lowering the curtain on medical malpractice, and surprisingly, I haven't talked about tort reform. I've talked about what can be done internally to see that there's good communication between staff and doctors, to see that doctors know the names of the staff, to do something about what I call the waiting for a lawsuit room. So you're not sitting there for an hour with nobody paying any attention to you. I think a lot can be done in this area.
Why don't you
and the positive news is that insurers are doing more than they did before.
Victor, before we get into a question that I can't wait to ask you, you've written a paper on this, how doctors can treat patients to reduce the level of lawsuits. Why don't you give us a list of what you think should be done? You call it lowering the temperature.
The patient's medical malpractice temperature, in my view, begins long before they've seen the doctor. I think when you call somebody and you're sick and they press 1, press 2, and you have 9, that's a very frustrating thing. I think there need to be better ways where the patient communicates with the hospital and doctor and gets to the person they need right away. I think leaving people in waiting rooms for an hour is inexcusable. If they're not sick when they walked in there, they may be sick when they get out. I call it the waiting for a lawsuit room. The patient's medical malpractice temperature has gone up even more. Communication between doctors and staff, I mentioned that. Know the staff's name, know who's there. More is being done on that, and there isn't and shouldn't be a wall of separation between so-called non-professionals, who are very important, the nurse who first meets you, and the doctor herself. Better, I see progress being made, but I think a lot can be done, and that will reduce claims. If a patient isn't angry, even if there's a bad result, they're unlikely to sue. Patients aren't already jumping up ready to sue. But if they've been treated bad and they feel uncomfortable and they don't feel they've been respected, yes, they're going to be responsive to a plaintiff's lawyer who solicits their business.
Victor, let's talk about this defensive medicine. My take on it comes from the Office of Technology Assessment, who years ago did a study. They concluded, one, that a lot of so-called defensive medicine is good medicine, it's just care. Two, that a lot of defensive medicine is not necessary, but it makes money for the doctors and hospitals. And three, there's not enough good data in this area. Now, let me ask you, if a doctor treating you and worrying about a lawsuit, always lurking in their mind, engages in an invasive procedure in order to cover his rear that is not necessary at all in terms of treating you well, but he does it to cover his rear, and he does a blood test or he does something that's invasive, is that a tort?
Very interesting. It depends on the facts, because if the doctor doesn't, let's say it's a catheter thing where it's invasive and it's a catheter going inside your heart, if he doesn't or she explain all the risks involved and explain his reason for doing so, at some point it could be a denial of informed consent, especially if something goes wrong, because the patient has gone into a situation with all the risks not fully explained to him or her. I think for all these studies, the AMA will come up with a study and the anti-tort reform will come up with a study, and I'm left to my own experience. I don't think in my life people have done tests that aren't needed, but some doctors do worry. They genuinely do. They may take an extra test or two that they don't think is necessary. When it comes to invasive tests, not a blood test, but something where they're going inside you, most doctors realize that they better think very carefully about prescribing such a procedure, because all of them, you mentioned infection, have risks.
Another question I want to ask you is, what's your estimate how many verdicts and settlements in any given recent year come from medical malpractice for injured patients? Because they always talk about it's going to break the system, it's going to wreck the insurance system. And every time I talk to people from medical associations and I say to them, can you give me an estimate? How much is transferred by your insurance companies nationwide on behalf of wrongfully injured patients? They don't know the figure. So you must know the figure.
No, I thank you for thinking I would. I don't. And a long time ago, about 25 years ago, when I really ended up more on the defense side, I've learned never to start arguing about these estimates, because it's like certain things where everybody has their own estimate. You try to dig in and try to find out what the actual facts are. And I leave that to others, but I don't have those figures. So I went into just arguing what's good policy, what's bad policy. If it's bad policy, really bad tort policy, let's say you're holding a doctor liable under tests that are unfair to her, and there's only a $10,000 spent, I don't think that that should be spent. It's unfair. If it's $10 billion, but it's all justified, a person's have engaged in wrongful conduct, the figure to me is irrelevant. It's the conduct, and whether or not somebody is being punished for conduct that is innocent, or whether somebody is able to escape the tort system where he or she has committed an act of malpractice. So that's my thinking, Ralph.
The problem, Victor, is it isn't irrelevant to the insurance companies because their big claim when they go to the state legislature and say we want to put caps and we want to restrict the rights of injured people, their big claim is they may be going broke. They're paying out too much. They're paying out more than their premiums. It's destabilizing the system. The doctors are upset because they're having to pay more premiums. Well, my survey of the available literature is that the amount of money in verdicts and settlements in medical malpractice, it's less than 40,000 people who get anything out of hundreds of thousands who are injured. And we'll get to that problem of the tort system in a minute. It's far less than $10 billion, the whole shebang for medical malpractice. And I think it's important for the government to produce data and stop this guessing game, to produce data so we can deflate the claims of the insurance companies where they do inflate their claims. You know, the property casualty insurance industry has never lost money since 1921. It gets its money from premiums. It gets its money from investment income. My concern about the civil justice system is that the vast majority of wrongfully injured people don't even file a claim. They don't even get into the courts. Sometimes because they don't know they're wrongfully injured, like by a doctor or a hospital, silent violence, or they're intaking some toxic chemical or what have you. But other times, they don't know their rights. And other times, they don't know how to find a lawyer. Does it bother you that the majority of wrongfully injured people are not in the civil justice system to get compensation and to generate deterrence?
I don't know the answer to that, but this is what I do know. Regardless of profit, in states like Mississippi, they were down to one company, and sometimes in some states, no available companies, so the doctors had to form their own mutual. If it was that profitable, more people would come in. This I also know. In Mississippi and Texas, after they passed so-called tort reform, what you call tort deform, I kind of enjoy that. I think that's clever. More companies came in, insurance became more available, and so did medical services in rural areas. So this is a debate where people almost come onto the field where one has a tennis racket and the other has a football. They're looking at different parts of the system. So I'm not here to question what you're saying. I think that there are people who probably are left out of the system. I think there needs to be good education of people. Here's the bad education of people. If you're on TV at night, late at night at 2 a.m., there are ads put on by plaintiffs' lawyers who are scaring people to death about taking certain medicines that can be life-saving, and they don't take their medicine. And that's not good. So good education of people about their rights in the area of medical malpractice is worthwhile. And you have a lot of foundations so that people know when they should seek a lawyer. And on the other hand, are not scared to death and don't take a medicine that they should take because they've seen an Oprah hyperbole on TV that isn't accurate.
Well, at 2 a.m. in the morning, there's a small audience, but on prime time, there's a big audience where Toyota and GM and Honda are saying, buy our cars, and not telling them they have defective airbags.
Well,
a little better balance here.
The people who are watching are maybe older people. I don't know. It's not me. And that would be a very interesting ad worth being on Saturday Night Live, where X Auto says, and by the way, let me tell you, our airbags don't work. I think that would be a very good Saturday Night Live ad.
Or like the drug companies have side effects. Give the side effects to buying a Toyota. Side effects may include...
Your wheels falling off, steering wheel may break in your hand, something like that.
Victor, let me ask you a summary question. List where you think the civil justice system should be strengthened from the point of view of injured people, and where you think it should be changed in the interest of the defendants.
I think there needs to be greater awareness of people of what their rights are under tort law. As you said in the beginning, most people don't even know what the word tort means. Good, solid education so people know their rights, everybody, and that they have access to the legal system. I feel, on the other hand, and there's a bill in Congress on this, that there's a part of the bar, it's a small part, that brings these baseless claims, mostly against small business, not against the businesses you're talking about. And their insurance companies settle the claim, insurance goes up, and there doesn't appear a good way to stop it because current punishment against frivolous claims are very weak. So you may not agree with that, but I think that needs to be strengthened. So if somebody brings a frivolous claim, not talking about loser pays at the end, a judge, a good judge, says there's no basis to this claim, I think the lawyer who brings that should be sanctioned. Likewise, if a defense lawyer brings a answer that's just there for delay, it's not real, it has no purpose, I think he or she should be sanctioned too. And there's a bill in Congress to do it, and I hope it gets support.
Well, you're even-handed on that one because, as you know, corporate lawyers are ingeniously clever in delaying, wars of attrition, overpapering, overcosting.
Welcome to the billable hour.
Yeah, that's right. When we were fighting against each other under the Clinton administration, there was a very close call where Clinton was about to sign the first step into federalizing product liability laws, which are now, as you say, the purview of the states. What has Clinton done here? During his 8 years, he signed some tort reform bills. And I know you don't like to speak for him, but could you give us some direct answer from Bill Clinton?
Yes, I can. Look, Ralph, right now, I stepped in. Schwartz, get out of the way. I need to answer this directly. I'm going to tell you this, Ralph, and it's only for your audience. You see, there was this guy named Bruce Lindsay who helped me. These bills came in front of me, and he took my glasses away. I thought it was tort reform. And, I needed to do that after that Lewinsky business. So I signed the tort reform bills, and later I found out it was tort reform. I didn't know.
So, President Clinton, you thought it was a baked good that you were signing away?
Well, a little bit like that. I am for caps on promiscuity. That's where I would cap things. But because Ralph doesn't like caps, I would make an exception for former public officials. So they could be promiscuous as much as you wanted to. That's freedom.
Did you say tort reform?
Yes, tort reform. I think it was needed in the public way. These various tarts that came up to me, they needed to reform their way. I was an innocent victim. I had no idea.
Well, let me tell you, Victor, I like the way you have direct access to these former presidents. I always thought the civil justice system has market characteristics, free market characteristics. Somebody's injured, someone finds a lawyer, pays a lawyer has a market incentive to advance the case. The courts are highly refereed, unlike decisions in Congress or the executive branch. I think you'll agree to this. This is an incredibly refereed system. If the jury comes in too high, the judge can reduce it. The defense can appeal it. It's all open court. Press can be there. So it's very refereed. So I think it's sort of a market system. President Reagan always thought that the market would take care of these things. What would President Reagan have said?
As you say this, Ralph, it's hard to come back, but I have. And I believe in the free enterprise system. It should be free to all rich people at any day of the week. And yes, there are courts, and they should be kept open. In California, we kept them open 24 hours a day, especially for traffic tickets. And also, in terms of free enterprise, we lost a big thing when we got rid of pay toilets. This was a very, very, very enterprising thing in the marketplace. People shouldn't have to go for free. I wouldn't make it expensive. No way. But a nickel or a dime here or there if you needed to use a facility, I think could have been a tax base that I called it the flatulent tax. And that was one I was for.
I can't hesitate asking you this question, President Reagan. You actually tell the press twice, once when you were president and once you were running for president, the following, quote, nuclear missiles once released can always be recalled?
Well, you can recall just about anything, and I thought they could. You see, one of my advisors said that we had a string on them, and they showed me a diagram, and felt, well, if I pulled that string, it would come back. But then I worried, what if it hit us? So I just let it go, I thought that was the best thing. And if we had gotten rid of the Soviet Union, this current guy wouldn't making all of the fuss in the Ukraine and places of that nature, wherever they may be.
Well, if the audience doesn't know it now, Victor is an actual accomplished impersonator, and he's actually performed on stage, and he connects with other impersonators.
You mean we weren't actually speaking to the ghost of President Ronald Reagan? I'm a little disappointed.
Or Bill Clinton. Let me just end on this note, Victor. How would anybody get in touch with you? Do you have a website? What would you like people to read? I say this because I think people should spend more time going over this terribly important issue. Almost every activity human beings engage in has risk, has hazards. When something materializes, people get injured. They have a right to have their day in court. We're starting the American Museum of Tort Law to educate people. We know, and I think you'll agree with this, that too many people don't take their jury notices seriously. They want to escape. Sometimes they'll just throw them away, the summons, and the courts are having a hard time getting enough people in the jury pool. So in conclusion, just give the listeners some idea.
Well, you probably can find, because this is an area where Mr. Nader and I agree about jury service, and you can find the Jury Patriotism Act. I know it has a heavy name, but it works to see that everybody serves on a jury. People complain about juries sometimes, and then they won't serve. And I think whether somebody is a CEO or works at Subway, they should serve. I think the person who can't afford jury service ought to be compensated. We worked on that law, and it has been law in Utah, Oregon, to see that people are paid when they can't afford to serve. We did a web thing called hotcoffeetruth.com. I appear with a couple other professors in that, and people might like to see that. And our firm's website is Shook, Hardy, and Bacon, www.shb.com, and there is some information that is there. The people who are the real tort reformers, which Ralph would call tort deformers, that's the American Tort Reform Association, www.atra.org.
Most jurors who go through the experience actually are very pleased, aren't they?
Most jurors are pleased with the system, but there are things that they want to make telephone calls, they can't. They don't have parking, and they don't have it. They're not paid enough. And I do believe that we need to improve our system so that everyone will serve, rich or poor, and make things reasonably comfortable. I fully support that, and I've supported the Jury Patriotism Act. It was interesting, with that one, somebody made a comment. They looked at the bill, Ralph, and somebody who had worked with you, and said, I can't find anything wrong with it, but if Victor Schwartz had anything to do with it, it must be bad. And I really liked that. I thought it was very funny.
How do they get a copy of this?
It's
jury
on the
bill?
web, and just go to the Jury Patriotism Act. You should be able to find it.
Okay.
I just had a quick question about coffee. The 85-year-old woman who had hot coffee spilled on her lap has gone down in history as a fraud. Was she really injured by that hot coffee from McDonald's? And who spread the lie that she was just trying to get some money from McDonald's?
She was seriously injured. She had third-degree burns. There is a movie called Hot Coffee that gives one side of the picture. The site I gave you, www.hotcoffeetruth.com, does not deny that the woman suffered very serious burns.
She didn't almost die? Didn't she almost die?
She had very serious burns. Here's the problem I had with that movie, the fundamental. They define tort law in a way that's not the right definition of tort law. Tort law is not a system that compensates people who are injured. Tort law compensates people who are injured due to the fault of another. And whether McDonald's was at fault or not in serving hot coffee we differ. I think that coffee is hot, and I know it's hot. She did have it between her lap. She did spill it, but that would be another hour if we debated a hot coffee thing.
But
I don't deny that she was very seriously injured. What I say is the issue of whether in that instance McDonald's was at fault or not is a very debatable point. And most people, even in spite of the movie, which many, many people saw, believe that with certain things, hot coffee, pumping gas. You should have smoking. You should have enough knowledge yourself to figure it out. But I know that people debate those things. I feel people have some degree of individual responsibility, but I'm here to state my views. It's not necessarily the views of others.
Right. A key point, David, a key point in that, just in wrapping it up, is that compared to its fast food competitors, McDonald's temperature in the coffee was much higher because they wanted it to remain hot in the car down the road for a longer time. So the argument is that if you have coffee at that high a temperature, it dramatically speeds up the rate of burning the human flesh.
And it wasn't the first burn.
They had others. Well, people will differ. If it's lower temperature, there are those on the other side who say the burns would have been just as severe. If you go to Starbucks and you spill coffee that comes from there on your lap, you're going to get burned. And it's a natural propriety of it. I mean, you can only heat things up into a boiling point. And when I make coffee at home, instant coffee, and I pour it in a cup, I'm pouring it out of a container that's boiling. It's hot. And people have different points of view. But I think the anti-tort reformers, it's just my judgment, have made a mistake in pursuing the hot coffee case. It's like debating Vietnam. They ought to go on to other things. It's just my view, because the cab driver still thinks she spilled it on herself. But again, I'm here to state my views. President Clinton, look, I knew this about hot coffee. I never spilled hot coffee on Lewinsky. I did not. I mean, I heated her up a different way. I can't say it right here, but I didn't need coffee to get her hot. I don't think so.
On that note, and taking into account that the jurors and judge were very skeptical when that case before them, and they heard all the evidence pro and con, and they came out that she deserved some compensation. Even though they recognized she had some fault, they took some dollar value for her fault, but she deserves some compensation. Listen, thank you very much, Victor. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Do you realize how rare it is for people on opposite sides of the civil justice system controversy even get in one room together to discuss this? So I want to thank you for doing it, and maybe we can extend it in the future.
Thank you very much, Ralph. It's a privilege to work with you at any time. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We've been talking to super lawyer and master impressionist Victor Schwartz, who's a partner in the law firm of Shook, Hardy & Bacon, chairs its public policy group. We were talking about tort reform. Thank you, Victor. This is the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We'll be back right after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, nader.org. If you'd like to get Ralph's weekly column in your mailbox each week, go to nader.org and sign up for that. Ralph, we've talked a lot about Wall Street on this program. The New York Times last week published an article about the turnover that's happening in the Justice Department's Wall Street Task Force, the group that put away Bernie Madoff and indicted SAC capital advisors in the country's biggest hedge fund scandal. Speaking to this turnover, Nader's Raiders was filled with Republicans, including Edward Cox, President Nixon's future son-in-law, William Howard Taft, one of the descendants of William Howard Taft, worked with you. Isn't this how it works? Corporatists do time prosecuting corporations so they learn how to defend them.
I've never seen it more expansive. You have these very bright attorneys. They work for the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan or Brooklyn or Washington. They prosecute corporate crime, or what they call white-collar crime. They get settlements. They negotiate agreements that we sometimes think are sweetheart agreements because they don't have the staff in the Justice Department or in the U.S. Attorney's Office to go to court against these giant corporations who have these huge law firms. And after a few years, they basically jump ship. And they go from, say, a salary of $150,000 or so to $3-4 million. They go to these big corporate law firms that establish a special section for them with younger lawyers. They put them in charge, and they pay them these humongous attorney fees. Now, if this goes on and on, just a recent prosecutorial star, Attorney Coyne in the Brooklyn U.S. attorney's office, just left and joined a big New York corporate law firm. If this goes on, isn't it fair to assume that these government attorneys looking forward to their next lucrative job are pulling their punches, not taking certain cases or settling them too easily with Citibank and Bank of America and Credit Suisse and other banks that have been on the hot seat? I think it's beginning to be clear that that is the case. It is true they're understaffed. They don't dare go to court. Therefore, they lose a bargaining chip with these big multinational companies and their law firms. However, when you look at some of the settlements, some of the deferred prosecutions, the years when the companies were allowed not to plead guilty and therefore not to have that on their record, I think they've been pulling their punches. I suggest that they be required to go at least 2 years without being able to take a job on the other side of the aisle. They also bring important information with them, and they're not supposed to disclose the information that they learned about how the Justice Department pursues its strategy of enforcement, but try and enforce that one.
As a taxpayer, it's offensive to me that our Justice Department is serving as a training ground for the people who defend the criminals. With Nader's Raiders, did you lecture these guys who went off and abandoned your cause?
They never did it that way, but they were working for us as law students, for example, and then they went into the private sector. But it's completely different. You're talking about government lawyers learning the skills, the tactics, the strategies,
right,
the inside information, and then they use it, in a sense, as an asset to increase their income 10, 20-fold. And that should not be allowed. There should be at least a 2-year period when they cannot do that.
It's almost like going to work for Apple for a couple of years so you can take all their trade secrets over to Microsoft.
Or Samsung.
Yeah, and they wouldn't allow that.
That's right. Now, listener might say, why only 2 years? Well, there's a constitutional aspect here that you cannot deprive someone of their property, in effect, but there's a rule of reason, and it applies to members of Congress. When they resign or quit, they cannot lobby for 1 or 2 years, the Congress. But if you push it further and say 5, 6, 10 years forever, you're going to lose in the courts.
Does that 2 years really make a difference? I mean, does it really make a difference for lobbyists? Would it make a difference for these prosecutors?
It might make a difference in terms of the preferred job they're looking for, because these law firms want quick action with that kind of know-how. And second, it might keep them in the Justice Department a little longer.
And by the way, with the congressmen, they go to work for the lobbyists. They just don't lobby.
Yeah, they can't directly lobby.
But just
they can, yeah.
But just taking the job is all that matters, because it signals to all the other congressmen that there's money waiting for you.
It's a tepid slap on the wrist, but at least it keeps the principle alive.
Ralph, the Wall Street Journal reported this week that TNT and other cable TV networks have been ever so slightly speeding up the frame rates of shows and movies that they broadcast, and this enables some of the shows to cram in as much as 2 additional minutes of commercials. Good thing? Bad thing?
It's a bad thing, because these cable companies, like the over-the-air broadcast, they're essentially monopolistic, and they are abusing the right of people to see programming and not ads. Already, in a 30-minute span, the ads are 9 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe even more. So I think the cable companies may be pushing their luck, because the viewers can just turn off the whole program or turn off the ads. So I think the collision of the greed of the revenue searchers by the cable companies is coming up against a boomerang. I wouldn't advise them to go much further. Having said that, the over-the-air networks and TV and radio stations are using our property. I think there should be a movement in this country titled Stop Misusing Our Property. The public airways belong to the public. They don't get a cent for renting it out to radio and TV stations 24 hours a day, who get it free, compliments to the Federal Communication Commission and federal law. We're the landlords. The radio and TV stations are the tenants. They get our property free and decide who says what and who doesn't 24 hours a day. And we ought to be pretty upset with that. We ought to develop a sense of Commonwealth property and say, we want our own audience network. We want our own time where we can program with studios locally, regionally, and nationally what we want to see, hear, and listen to. And we want to make you, the radio and TV stations, pay rent to us for using our property. That's what I think should be done.
What we do on this show is we slow it down so people can process all the information that's coming your way. Ralph, on this subject, subliminal advertising was outlawed. Do we live in a climate now where the broadcast networks could start employing subliminal advertising and get away with it? And even if it were challenged in court, it would be a First Amendment right?
It's very difficult to define subliminal, especially with the new video technology. But as the envelope gets pushed more and more, and just clear, visually risque or porno or violent ads are permitted, they don't need subliminal because they're doing it directly. I saw the other day an insurance company ad by an auto insurer that was incredibly violent. That would never have been on the air years ago. So as they are given more leeway to be more porno, more violent, more risque, they have less need to engage in subliminal advertising that was first brought to our attention by Vance Packard, the great muckraking author of the 50s and 60s.
Vance Packard.
Yeah, Vance Packard.
Right. Elizabeth Warren for president. Elizabeth Warren for president. Steve, you want to get to listener questions? Elizabeth Warren for president.
Yeah.
That's
Elizabeth Warren.
That's what's called David's overt subliminal advertising.
Yeah, he's stealing that bit from Kevin Nealon. Yes,
that's right. He did. That's right. He did do that bit.
Oh, don't act like you don't know. Kevin, I'm telling.
Well, come on. Wait a second. He didn't invent that.
Well,
he did something like that.
He popularized the bit. All right. We're going to go to a Facebook question here.
That was the obvious. I mean, come on. That wasn't.
Can I go to a Facebook question, David, or are you just going to defend yourself here? You should have Victor should have stayed here and defended you. Let's go to some Facebook questions. This comes from Matt Prine, and I also know that our executive producer, Alan Minsky, wanted to know your views on this, Ralph. Matt Prine writes, can you describe how state-owned banks, like in North Dakota, would fill state coffers with the windfall revenue now hoarded by the vampire banking industry?
Well, I'm all for the State Bank of North Dakota. It's operated properly, prudently. It never had to be bailed out. And a lot of conservative North Dakotans love this State Bank of North Dakota. And it came into being about 100 years ago because the regular commercial banks were mistreating or not loaning money or overcharging farmers. So I'm all for state banks. They are good yardsticks for commercial banks. And after the huge taxpayer bailouts and the whole business of big banks in New York too big to fail so they can fail on the backs of taxpayers, who are they to talk about not having a state bank in every state to be a prudent yardstick to make them behave?
Kurt Heidinger writes, whatever happened to the EPA?
Well, it's struggling along on a $10 billion budget, which is about what we spend on the boondoggle project called missile defense, which has never worked for 25 years. Sort of ridiculous in terms of how money is spent because the EPA's function is to control silent violence, to prevent it, to diminish it. We call it air pollution, water pollution. We call it hydrocarbons. We call it beryllium. We call it lead. The EPA is surrounded by corporate lobbyists. It's pummeled by members of Congress, and it's not adequately defended by progressive members of Congress or even, on most occasions, the White House. So I think the EPA needs to be given more money. They are responsible for safe drinking water in this country, for the air you breathe, for how much contaminants get into the food supply that you consume, for the water that you fish from or want to have a vacation nearby. I think the EPA has been terribly pummeled and terribly underfunded and doesn't have the authority to do effectively what the people expect to be done by the federal government in managing the violence of what we too charitably call pollutants.
Obama, though, has been using it more than most presidents have through executive action.
He has encouraged them in some areas, and right before election in 2012, he discouraged them from putting out certain standards. I suppose EPA's standards dealing with emissions from new coal plants have been considered quite strong. I don't think we're going to see many new coal plants being built in this country, and thank goodness for that.
And what very quickly, what was your role in the formation of the EPA?
Well, in 1970, I played a major role in Earth Day, 1,500 events, by the way, all over the country. Put it on the map, covered Time, Newsweek, led the evening network news. And that was the time we were pushing very meticulously on Capitol Hill what now is called the Air and Water Pollution Acts, which are the seminal, fundamental regulatory framework to this day for controlling air and water pollution. And one of the proposals was, well, who's going to administer it? Is it going to be administered by the Department of Interior? No, it should have a brand new agency, and it was called the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. The problem is it's completely overburdened. It's supposed to have responsibility on pesticide. There are thousands of pesticides and pesticide combinations, and it's hardly made a dent in testing them and prohibiting them or reducing their use in our water or in our food. We need to take another look at the EPA and see if we want more federal cops on the corporate violence beat.
Right. I should mention, because we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary, that Steve Scrovan is the director of An Unreasonable Man, which tells the story of Ralph and the role he played in the formation of the EPA, along with other things. So people should go rent An Unreasonable Man.
Thanks for the plug, David. I think that's a very nice way to go out here. You've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I want to thank our guest today, Victor Schwartz, super lawyer and master impressionist. Join us again next week. We'll be back.
And thank you very much, Steve and David, and thank the listeners. Spread the word. Get more stations for us. We can get things done.
Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Say you're tired of trying